Hello and welcome everyone to Spirit of Truth Church, Spirit of Truth Outreach, for this episode on the moral argument, moral obligations. This is part of our Apology Accepted series. We've been doing this for a number of weeks now, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's talk. But before we begin, we actually had a really good question posed in response to the last video we did. And I wanted to address it at least a little bit here at the beginning of this video, since I thought, ooh, this is actually a really well thought out, kind of well-written thing. So the question comes from Lance, and the question is made about a statement that I made, which was that it's obvious in our face that moral objectivity is a recalcitrant fact against naturalism, and it's just part of the fabric of our reality. And he disagreed, which is absolutely fine to disagree. And his question was like, who is our? And typically he says when people made these types of statements, they're always unclear, or they don't really say obvious to who and things of that nature. So I'd like to first address sort of the scope. So actually in this series, we're not arguing against moral anti-realism. And I'm not presenting a case for moral realism. That's actually beyond the scope of it. This was just simply stating for people who recognize these things. And I know I said it in such a way that didn't come across, but this was saying for people who recognize the moral fabric of reality, this is a way to organize that data. And in doing so, it becomes very clear that Christianity is the best possible explanation among the explanations that are out there. So these talks and the book from the Baggots in this case was not dealing with handling that issue of moral anti-realism. However, they did write a book that does handle moral anti-realism, and it's called Good God, and it's an exceptional book. And I'm going to read a part of it here. Actually, mainly it's quotes from other sources that they quoted in the book. But that's actually a phenomenal treatise against just the moral anti-realism and moral subjectivism and things of that nature. And again, I'm going to assume that Lance probably was, and I could be wrong in this, but assume that he was a form of, because again, there's many different forms of anti-realism. I'm going to assume that he's probably non-objectivism, that moral facts do exist, but they're not objective. In other words, something is right or wrong depending on, and it truly is right or wrong, depending on whether one thinks it's right or wrong. Okay? So here's the issue. I'm going to go ahead and read this because this is essentially Plantinga arguing, oddly enough, for moral anti-realism, but not necessarily an atheistic version of it. And I thought it was kind of cool, so I just wanted to go ahead and share this. So let me go ahead and read this. So here's the issue. This is Plantinga. Truths are the sort of things persons know, and the idea that there are or could be truths quite beyond the best methods of apprehension seems peculiar and outre and somehow outrageous. What would account for such truths? How would they get there? Where would they come from? How could the things that are in fact true or false, propositions let's say, exist in serene and majestic independence of persons and their means of apprehension? How could there be propositions no one has ever so much grasped at or thought of? It can seem just crazy to suppose that propositions could exist independent of minds or persons or judging beings. That there should just be these truths, independent of persons and their noetic activities, can, in certain moods and from certain perspectives, seem wildly counterintuitive. How could there be truths, or for that matter falsehoods, if there weren't any person to think or believe or judge them? Okay, so again, what Plantinga is going to do is he's going to point out an issue that it seems like propositions need minds to think of them, so maybe the anti-realist has a thought. Maybe he's got a point here that these things aren't just, quote, part of the fabric of the universe. So Plantinga then goes on to say this. So what we have here is a sort of antinomy. On the one hand, there's a deep impulse toward anti-realism, that there can't really be truths independent of noetic activity. On the other hand, there's the distinguishing fact that anti-realism, at least the sorts we've been considering, seems incoherent and otherwise objectionable. Okay, so we aren't going to get into why. Again, I'm just sort of offering this as an interesting thought here. We have here a paradox seeking resolution, a thesis and antithesis seeking synthesis. And what is, by my lights, the correct synthesis was suggested long before Hegel. This synthesis was suggested by Augustine, endorsed by most of the theistic tradition, and given succinct statement by Thomas Aquinas. And what is that? Quote, Even if there were no human intellects, there could be truths because of their relation to the divine intellect. But if, per impossible, there were no intellects at all, but things continued to exist, then there would be no such reality as truth. The thesis then is that truth cannot be independent of noetic activity on the part of persons. The antithesis is that it must be independent of our noetic activity. And the synthesis is that the truth is independent of our intellectual activity, but not of God's. So essentially the idea is okay, we can have anti-realism, but all morality is not based or rooted in the noetic activity or the thinking capabilities of human beings. It's actually rooted in the mind of God. And thus it becomes objective and it becomes binding over all creation. And for all intents and purposes, it would look little different than a realist understanding of morality. So in terms of how one experiences it, the force of it would always be there. Now, one other thing I wanted to say on that is, was referencing with regard to the obvious in our face. What I mean by that is, so for example, we're dealing with children. And, we've got a 2-year-old, or not 2-year-old, I was thinking of a 2-year-old. We've got a 5 and a 7-year-old. And, as old enough as they were old enough to know that some things were theirs, they were unhappy when things were stolen from them. Or taken by someone else. And it wasn't just that they didn't have the thing anymore. So remember, the issue wasn't, oh, you took it, now I don't have it, so I'm just sad that I don't have it. It wasn't that. It wasn't even, I'm simply mad at you for causing me a negative feeling. There was a recognition that you've done something wrong. There's a recognition that someone has done something wrong, and that simply returning the thing is actually not enough. That's not, there's an aspect of justice, that a wrong was done and should be righted somehow. And so I argue that this actually goes through the entirety of how we understand the judicial system, and that once you walk away from a form of moral objectivism, you walk away from a justice system that actually works, makes sense, and is fair and unbiased. Because the second you do that, one could simply say, well, in someone's mind, again, going with the non-objectivist thing, a way of working by here, in someone's mind, something is or is not a moral fact. Oh, here's a good example. Some people are now calling words violence. And so the comment is, well, no, you've done me violence because you've said these certain words in my presence or against me. Well, here's the thing. In moral non-objectivism, I don't see how you would get around the idea that, yeah, that is actually violence, because that is what they think. And then, as violence, that's something that really should or could be prosecuted. But the problem is this opens the door for everything. The second you go there, anytime anyone thinks something has been done to them that they now say is wrong in some way, you can now seek justice, quote, justice or a penalty from it. And the problem with that is that kind of breaks the whole system. All of a sudden you get people prosecuting people for anything. There's no standard. There's no law being prosecuted against. It's what's in individual minds. But yet we have laws, I think, as a reflection of this reality that there is an agreed upon, not just agreed upon, but there is a morality that we all recognize. And so even from a young age, you see this. You see where people wanting justice. People say, well, that's not fair. That's not just. That's not right. This type of language and the ease with which we express it seems built in. It seems built into who we are. And one could say, well, that's maybe evolution building that in. And I would simply argue that to this is, we can get into the evolution side of it. That's kind of beyond what I'm going to answer today. But there are serious issues with trying to put things like rationality and reason and logic and justice and beauty, and trying to put those things into DNA and say, oh, no, that's simply a result of DNA, or that's simply a result of all of this kind of stuff. There are real issues with that, again, it's beyond the scope of what we're going to address here. But anywho, I thought the question was kind of fun, and those are my comments again. The goal of the talks isn't really to address moral anti-realism. It was really just to present a case for the things that we see, for those who agree upon them. And then the second one was, why is blatantly obvious in our face? I think our entire justice system is based off of this. I think that, again, people express these notions from a very young age and do so. And yes, I understand there are people, as they get older in life and do philosophy and things, that then they start to question all this stuff. But the average everyday person is not questioning justice, is not questioning is there right or wrong. Even if they've been trained to sort of think that way, they operate in a way that says, no, when something is done wrong, I want justice for it, okay, when push comes to shove. So that'd just be a brief explanation, and it might not be the answer that Lance was looking for, but it's at least just some thoughts on it. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into moral obligations. So there's an importance in nature of these moral obligations. Moral obligations are part of something we call the deontic family of ethical concepts. And deontic just means duty-driven. So in other words, moral obligations are things that you have a duty to perform. Okay? Deontic ethics includes things like moral permissibility, things you are allowed to do. Moral obligation, things you have a duty to do, or that you, in some sense, must do. And then moral forbiddenness, things in which you are not allowed to do. So again, there's a bunch of different classifications of right and wrong, right? It could be right to do something. It may be permissible to do something. It could be wrong to do something. But again, this employs language of right and wrong, that there is something actually right and wrong about actions. And where does this ought come from? You ought to do this. You ought not to do that. See, the second that we get into that language of oughtness, or that language of ought, it presupposes that it should or should not be done. And then the question is, well, according to who? According to whose mind should it or should it not be done? According to what? Where is the obligation? Who is obliging me to do this? Where is this obligation coming from? Government? Well, government laws can be changed. Contracts can be changed. Anything can be changed unless it's either part of the fabric of reality or it's part of an unchanging God. In other words, an unchanging God has decreed these things. Virtue ethics. Before we get on to that. Again, though there are benefits, the moral demand is less contingent and more binding and categorical than that is. Virtue ethics doesn't get rid of the need for moral obligations. In fact, virtue ethics makes best sense only if there are real moral obligations, okay? We don't mean, again, a feeling of obligation. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about, oh, I feel as though I should do something. I feel as though I shouldn't do something. No, that's not what we're talking about. Whether you actually are obliged to do something or not, that's the issue at stake. And again, they're not just rules or suggestions. They're inescapable. It is an imperative. That one ought not kill someone is beyond just whether one thinks it's right or wrong, other people think it's right or wrong, or the government thinks it's right or wrong. It truly is right or wrong. And I'll just say this in terms of the reason in theology or Christianity is, in part, one, you have God commanding that it's wrong. Two, you also have the fact that people are made in the image of God. And so killing another human being is actually an attack on God himself. And so you can come at it from two different ways, as interesting enough as it is. Now, you also have people like Kant, who came up with the categorical imperative. And he essentially wanted to come up with a universally applicable moral standard that wasn't dependent on any goal desired by the subject. He essentially wanted to come up with, okay, what's the bare bones moral that if I follow this, I'll always get to the right conclusion? Okay. Again, the other way of going about it, hypothetical imperatives, depend on their legitimacy, on some extent, on the desired goal of the subject. So you sort of run into these issues when you try to figure this out through pure reason. Kant's critique of pure reason. Again, the categorical imperative style of moral objection also requires an authority. That's the other interesting thing. It's sort of like, okay, so if we have a categorical imperative, if we have a baseline moral, why are we obliged to do it? So we're not even, at this point, really trying to define what morality is in terms of the rules themselves. We're really asking, what's the foundation for this? Why ought I obey any of this? And this was a fascinating comment made in the debate by William Lane Craig and Eric Wielenberg at North Carolina State University that I was able to attend a few years back. And one of the things that Wielenberg said is when the morality that the best that I can describe it from my memory is the Platonic forms. In other words, the abstract moral. When the abstract moral impresses itself upon him, he never came up with a good reason of how that actually happens, at least in that debate. When that impressed upon him, he simply said, if it doesn't line up with my personal happiness, I don't have to do it. And I won't do it. That's essentially what he said. So he may have argued, again, that there were morals. I think he did actually argue there were morals. But the problem is he lacked any understanding of a moral obligation. There was no obligation to obey the morals that he had. And I think that was a serious flaw in his thinking that William Lane Craig did address, but I don't know how many people picked up on it. Again, what are some of the results that we see? So here's a good example. Say, for example, you break morality. Well, what happens? Violation causes feelings of guilt. Now, again, I mean, feelings of guilt one way or another, it does happen. It does happen. Another is alienation from other people, from communities, from society. Okay? An obligation is going to convey the notion of an absolute verdict. Okay, so again, these are things that we tend to incorporate in our language, that we tend to incorporate in our thinking without even trying hard to do so. And people can say, oh, well, you can philosophize your ways around them. Yeah, true, in some sense. I still argue that those philosophies don't actually cohere properly, and they aren't indicative of reality. But again, we find in reality that obligation tends to be absolute. We find that violating that results in guilt and alienation. So again, what do moral obligations do? Well, a judgment about a moral obligation is kind of like a verdict on my own action. It brings reflection to a closure. Or in other words, I reflect on whether I should or shouldn't do something. I have a moral obligation to do it. Therefore, my reflection is done and we move on. Moral obligation also involves accountability, responsibility, and they hold for persons simply as persons. A moral obligation doesn't hold for a non-person. Moral obligation also means that there's someone to whom you are accountable. Again, this is all part of moral obligations. It's like once you recognize that that is a real thing, all of a sudden you've got to have a being that can enforce this. You've got to have a being that you are obliged to obey. Now, what happens when you lose hold of obligations? Well, in utilitarianism, essentially by doing good, you are likely to, what does that mean in utilitarianism? So these are some other ways of kind of getting around obligations or something. Or I'll say it like this, of framing obligations in different ways. So utilitarianism. Good is where you produce better overall consequences than by not doing good. So in other words, in some way of registering, whether it's registering utility at the individual level, the community level, the family level, the society level, the global level, the universe level, however you're choosing, which again, there's no necessary, you'd have to argue, I suppose, ultimately at the universe level, but who's going to be able to calculate that? So you have to arbitrarily limit your search here, or limit your investigation. You're doing more good than harm. Now, what this is a consequentialist theory. In other words, with utilitarianism, something is good or bad, not because it's good or bad, but because of the outcomes that it produces. So why do you need a moral binding obligation to maximize utility? And the answer can't be because a moral binding obligation maximizes utility. Okay, you can't use the thing to answer the thing. Why are we obliged to maximize utility? Why? Why is that a thing that should be done? Why is that good? Why is maximizing utility the right thing to do? That question's unanswered. See, here's the thing. There's a way of thinking, sure, but why? Why am I obligated to follow this? See, the problem is when ethical theories are often presented, they're presented as, well, choose which one you like. Pick from the potpourri of ethical theories, see which one best fits you. That's not the way to view ethical theory. If we're talking about good, evil, right, wrong, you should not do this, ought not, I need to know, why am I obliged to follow this? Again, there's no authority in utilitarianism. Now, there are certain versions of Christian utilitarianism. It's fascinating. I still think they're problematic, though. I think they're problematic because I do not believe in Scripture that God has talked about morality in terms of consequentialism, in terms of the outcome. He seems to more talk about morality in terms of actions being right or wrong, and arguably you can go divine command theory or however you want to do that to get that. Additionally, even if we could somehow say that this is good, we haven't explained why it's good, and we don't have an obligation to bring it about. Again, to affirm moral obligations based only on considerations of well-being misses the importance and centrality of the question of what gives obligations their authority. Why do I have to do this? And Harris gets nervous when asked to spell out a theory of moral obligations. Oddly enough, he also denies free will. So there's some interesting pieces to this. And Harris is one of the authors on this topic. He's a professor on this topic. Now, that's utilitarianism. Okay. Again, it assumes the essential equality of persons as well. Here's another issue. Utilitarianism assumes the essential equality of all persons. In other words, given everything about a person, one person is equivalent to another. But on what basis? That doing so maximizes utility? Again, we're kind of using the thing to answer the thing. We're all equally unimportant in some sense in utilitarianism. The society is better than the individual, greater than the individual. And I would argue again that theism provides a binding authority that naturalistic systems cannot. For example, there's a reality where one could say, I like this example, there's a dictator, and somehow this dictator is going to kill a whole bunch of people in the future, and so you have this opportunity to shoot him when he's a baby, okay? It's a common, philosophical extreme situation, right? And the question is it moral to do so? So under utilitarian understanding, I don't see how you get around not killing the baby. Like, I mean, you're talking about mass murder of hundreds of millions of people, or however many. Under utilitarianism, I think you got to do it. However, in a Christian worldview, you can't. That would be sinful and immoral, because that baby, regardless of what that baby is going to do in the future, is an image bearer of God that does constitute murder. And some might say, well, that's insane. You just allowed 100 million people to die. No, that's not it. That's not it. I had a decision, or we have a decision to make in a given moment of time, whether to take life or not. And that is moral. That baby's got a decision whether to take life or not, and so does every single person down the line. And this is key. The second you go into utilitarianism, you can start falling into this issue of applying justice before the situation even occurs. And the reality is justice should only ever be applied after the situation occurs, which unfortunately does not prevent the situation from happening. Sinful people are sinful people. They're going to do what they're going to do. But we don't start employing justice before. And when people start to say, oh, well, no, we should start doing that, it's funny. There was a movie called Minority Report, and I can't, agree with everything in it in terms of, there's some scenes in there that I would disagree with. But the concept was fascinating. The concept was, can you be judged guilty of a crime before you commit it? And so they go back in time and they try to essentially, catch people right before the act was committed and then convict them of it and throw them in prison. And it's like, well, wait a second, what is going on here? But here's the thing. I don't know how many people would disagree with that today. I think there might be a lot of people that agree with that kind of thinking. To cut it before it happens. And there's a lot of dangerous places that could lead. So, let's see what else we've got here, including a personal God. Okay, so another interesting thing, and I would say this is the Christian understanding of this, is something called divine command theory. It's one of a couple of different Christian understandings. It's the one that I would hold to. And here's essentially what divine command theory holds. It holds that God seems to be the one who's got the authority to invest in morality. And he, with the sort of clout that most intuitively think it has. In other words, most people would say, or I would say most people would say, but when you think about the type of authority that you would want behind morality, you're thinking of a godlike figure. You're thinking of a figure that's perfectly just, perfectly, knows morality perfectly, can instantiate it perfectly, in his own self, and can hold people accountable. Okay, that being of God. Okay, and the inclusion of a personal God within that framework. So not only could it be just God, but a personal God, you can now integrate legislative, in other words, law passing, executive, essentially upholding the law, and then judicial, judging the people's transgressions against the law. You can get all of that in a way that no mere finite person could. And that's the exciting thing, is when you actually get a personal God who can do all of these things, who can legislate, execute, and then judge. It's really kind of amazing that you get the whole package. Now, another aspect of this is what about arbitrariness? So some people say, well, what if you're, I don't agree with your God's morality. Okay, fine. It's not arbitrary, though. I would argue that whenever there's a disagreement with people's understanding of the morality as proposed by Scripture, what we actually have is not a deficiency in the morality. We have a deficiency in their understanding of the nature and character of God and of themselves. That actually what happens in that situation is they think too little of themselves. Or they think too little of others. And this cuts everything from the gender issues to the pro-life, pro-choice issues. It's thinking too little of oneself and not understanding the character and nature of God properly, at least when one is trying to argue that Christian morality is incorrect. Now, another interesting question that could pop up is, well, where does God's authority derive? Well, God has supreme power, knowledge, and goodness, and all three are going to essentially underwrite his moral authority. Again, he's created us for this world, he's stamped us with his image, and he has the power to hold us accountable for our actions. And there's no reason to doubt his authority or his good use of it. So this is another thing. Well, I don't like that God would send people to hell, or I don't like, okay, fine on the surface, but let's actually get into the details of the conversation. Let's get into the hard points of the conversation and ask what's going on. A lot of people will say, oh, I don't like God would send people to hell. Well, here's that sort of the answer to that is, well, is there any reason to send someone to hell, for example? And then we have to get into conversations of morality. And so what's fascinating about that is you actually see that the 10 Commandments and the first couple of commandments are what? They're commandments about how people relate to God. Most people don't even acknowledge those as good or evil anymore, and yet they're the top three. And so we see then that these types of commandments are actually broken for eternity. And because they're broken for eternity and people must be judged for eternity, hell is the place where people are judged for eternity. Now someone would say, what if they repent? Here's the thing. I'll throw this to you. I have a feeling that if anybody in hell actually repented, God would forgive them. But especially they said, no, Jesus is my Savior. But here's the problem. No one's going to. That's sort of the issue that people don't understand, is that no one's going to get into that scenario and actually repent at that point, because repentance and faith and salvation depend upon God's action. And once you're at the point of hell, you have essentially said no to all of God's action and are now truly by yourself. God is no longer interacting with you in a way that would draw you to him, and a sinful human nature, having an inclination that desires self only, is never going to want God. So there's a number of interesting scenarios when we talk about hell to really think through in that before we make a judgment, for example, on God or something like that, about whether or not he should send someone to hell. And it's one of my specialties. I love discussing it and thinking about that. Okay. Some people also say that, God's authority needs no justification. He just simply is the authority because he's God. That's fine. And there's an interesting thing here. There's actually a steep price to pay for rejecting moral authority. We've got Kitcher, who denies moral obligation, says it's all about extending what was provided by evolution. Okay, there's some scary things there. Evolution, well, we'll get on this. When you start getting into evolution or things that evolution may have produced, okay, we just look at the animal world and we start to see things and we're like, oh, I wouldn't behave like that in the animal kingdom. And the reason why animals do behave like that is they're not persons. Persons have a morality attributed to them that other creatures simply do not. And again, there's a real challenge to account for the authority of moral obligations if we're going to deny God in any way, shape, or form. And so again, with divine command theory, God simply commands it, thus it is moral or immoral. It's simply his fiat word, based on his, and I would argue based on his nature and character. He's not going to arbitrarily pick something. Everything he says, that he says from eternity, is going to be based and rooted in his own nature and character. And again, I would say that Christianity is going to point to a future where morality is actually natural. This is the crazy thing. We all have a moral sense, but I actually think Christianity, for those who are redeemed, those who accept Jesus Christ, he's making us into the true image of God, into Jesus Christ's image-bearingness, if you will. And I think morality is going to be natural to the point of breathing. We aren't even going to think about it. At some point, morality is going to be just so, this is just how we do and what we act in terms of the eternal state or the millennial kingdom, resurrection, that people who are saved or redeemed will simply not act in evil ways at all. It'll be as natural as breathing. And so it's fascinating. Like, that's even the future. The question is well, if you don't take a divine understanding of morality, you run into this issue with the moral obligation, specifically of what's actually pushing us into a good direction or a right direction. Nothing. You're kind of left impotent. You're kind of left without any power to actually get any moral work done, or at least any reason to get any moral work done. And so those are some of the issues of moral obligations. And so next time, in actually just 1 week, it'll be next week, because I missed last week, we will be discussing moral knowledge and the issues of certainty, and essentially how do we have moral knowledge and can we access it. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope you've enjoyed this talk on moral obligations. I'm going to do one quick thing. Oh, Lance, you're there! Hey! I'm going to say hi! There we go. There you go. Okay, I'm not a cognitivist and don't think there are any moral facts. Oh, okay, that's fine. I was just taking a guess. I mean, there's a number of different views, right? Cool. Awesome. Well, I just wanted to say that's so fun to have somebody respond live, and I'm so glad you came in today and things like that. And I'll say hi to Danny as well. Just saying that in the chat here. And again, thank you guys so much for coming in and checking it out and having the conversation. Like I said, anytime posts are done, I didn't get to it immediately, by the way, and I know I'm just going to say this on there, simply because I was out lecturing and there was just an insane amount of busy stuff, and I wanted to read a little bit more and make sure I had some fun things to share on it and stuff like that. Oh, thank you. All right, guys. Well, I hope you all have a wonderful night. Again, next week we're going to be covering moral knowledge. It should be a lot of fun. And let's see here, moral knowledge. And then on Thursday, I'll actually be doing the Cleaning House talk on the Day of Atonement in my theology series. So, but anywho, I thank you guys so much for coming. I hope you have a wonderful night. And yeah, thank you again. Thanks for coming to Spirit of Truth Outreach. Have a great night.